not.
It's on. Okay.
Wait, maybe it's working.
Oh, you got it, Mark.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go.
Okay. All right.
Right.
I'm gonna start recording. Just for the sake of safety.
All right. Well, hello. Thank you for agreeing to interview for our issue of Paprika. As you know, the premise of our issue is to bring attention to a certain perceived lack of a utopian spirit of sorts in architecture today, or maybe a general sense that there's a lack of a general vision or driving purpose to the discipline. We're wondering if you agree with this.
Yes.
Yes. What do you think has been do you think there's a value then in talking about utopia at this moment, or is it like a waste of time?
I think it's a messy word because I think it's become completely devalued in terms of what was, when it was invented, its operative purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So let's can we unpack that word?
Yes, of course.
So it's an invented word. It didn't exist in Greek ever until what? 1517, wherein Thomas More decided to coin it, right? So at that point, it meant no place. Who? Topos, no place. So how could you have a place which is architectural, which is design, which is there, which is no place? And No Place was a kind of experimental novel in Thomas More's writing. It was an experimental novel in two parts. No Place included a conversation about the very, very real place that Thomas More lived in, that is Britain, and a very, what we would now call a dystopian description of Britain, and a description of a place that was nowhere, which had been, quote unquote, discovered by a mariner, but then lost, right? So it was only in the text, right? Which was supposedly a kind of antonym, a kind of counter example to the real place of Britain, right? And it was book one, book two. So book one was the place, book two was No Place, and it's like a diptych, right? And so you could see that was meant in terms of More's intention to the one to be layered on the other, right? So everything that was wrong with the real place, if you layered over it the No Place, it, in a sense, transparently criticized the one with the other, right? It was a critical operation, right? Very much, I compare it always to Eisenstein's filmic method of montage, when you take a frame and another frame without fading the scene one into the other, but literally splicing them together so that they collapse into each other backwards and forwards. And so that to me is a very, very operative, critical medium, right? It then, by use over the centuries, became a commonplace term, utopia, for anything that seemed to be ideal and out of reach, or anything that seemed to be unreachable and unattainable, right? And applied to any kind of ideal scheme, right? Including applied to a range of projects in architecture which stemmed from an entirely different tradition, which was the Renaissance discovery of Vitruvius and the attempt to develop what we might call not utopias but ideal cities, ideal plans, architectural plans, ideal layouts for cities that were well organized, right? Either for defense in the Renaissance and actually all the way through, even in relationship to Ebenezer Howard's garden cities which were not utopias. They were plans for decentralizing the large cities in order to overcome questions of crowding, questions of relationships to the countryside, questions of industrial pollution, and so on. So, in a sense, ideal cities as a structural construct in architecture have a long tradition, right? There is also another tradition, which is what I would call the apocalyptic tradition, which both in philosophy and in religious thought thinks of another world to which we are all destined to disappear to, right? Like the city of St. John and so on and so forth. It's the ideal city of Jerusalem. And so on. So all those things, I think, have been sort of lumped together and called utopias or utopian. And I think it's a very misleading word, because I think actually if we actually construct a vision of what an architecture might be in relationship to the problems that architecture can solve, as opposed to the problems that architecture can't solve, that's very different from conceiving a utopia. Right. So when I said yes to your question, I would also add that I'm saying yes to something which I don't believe is the real problematic of what architecture somehow has to grapple with right now, and has always had to grapple with. That is how it can make a difference in a social setting, right? And what's it for? So in that sense, I would say that there is a certain lack of idealism in architecture, in relationship to ideal cities. Right. That the notion of an ideal city, all the way through to the new urbanism, has more or less trickled down into the profession or to general practice at various moments in the development of the profession, in the development of the discipline, but not always, and always in a fairly devalued state. So, for example, the diagrams of the radiant city of Le Corbusier were, when mass-produced in a place like Pruitt-Igoe in Chicago, devalued to the point where all the supporting mechanisms that Corbusier imagined would actually make his particular version of housing in relationship to zoning, in relationship to all the other functions of the city work, are stripped out, and all you get is a diagram of a housing block.
In the form of it.
Right. And even to the point where the diagram of the housing block strips out the communitarian features that made the unité d'habitation work as a cooperative, right, as a social unit. Right? So to a certain extent, I think that, well, we can talk actually a little bit more about what today's problem is and why idealism is so sort of ambiguously absent. But why don't you continue?
Well, can I ask you a follow-up
Yeah.
to what you just said? I'm very curious. The Corbusier Radio City and then Pruitt-Igoe as two examples to me seem almost Pruitt-Igoe, the way that you talked about it, almost aligned with this sort of apocalyptic philosophy. And I'm wondering, is there kind of a tipping point between utopianism as we see it in Corbusier, as we see it in kind of this derivative ideology of the planned city, and then the dystopian on the other end of the spectrum?
Well, I think the problem with something like Pruitt-Igoe is that it's not all architecture's fault, right? We have perfectly reasonable housing blocks designed by Yamasaki. Right? If they were anywhere else in the world, maybe by the banks of Lake Geneva, they'd still be existing, they'd still be operating as perfectly good housing blocks. The problem there is the social policy of the municipality in relationship to the extremes of inequality, both ethnic and economic, that existed in the way in which they were used to warehouse a particular population. And that particular population stripped not given architecture, but stripped of the benefits that would allow that architecture to function, to allow them to function as human community in those housing blocks. So there's nothing technically wrong with the architecture, right? So it's a very what you could say is and one of the criticisms that Team 10 made of the kind of the CIAM diagrams, right, is that the extreme zoning separation of housing from work, the extreme cutting away of the fabric of the street and the generic isolation that housing blocks construct in a social scene. That also, the architecture there can be, to a certain extent, blamed. Just as the new cities in China can be blamed from stripping the Hutong from all their interrelational and generational connectivities, right? And putting, the old people someplace, the young people another place, putting everybody isolated from their family networks in these, repetitive housing blocks. So there, I think you can say that the architecture, which somehow has made of an ideal diagram, or a supposedly ideal diagram, like the Radiant City, when it's stripped into a particularly economically, technologically neoliberal mode, right, becomes just a commercial warehouse as opposed to a social entity.
Would you say that then these architectural visions or proposals would always need to be attended with a strong political project then?
Well, I would say political, social, and local. Yesterday we had a very interesting talk about the way in which after Fukushima, after the big wave and after the destruction, the way in which the social groupings that were left formed quite naturally and completely tightly, only to be then, for survival in the 2 or 3 weeks after the catastrophe, only to be again deracinated and separated out by the bureaucracy of the municipality that had to have some kind of order to separate out all these nicely and tightly constructed community supports, right? Where architecture actually could have, at that moment, begun to inquire as to what would be the right kind of combined shelters for those supports to continue.
Do you see that as utopian?
What?
Do you see that as utopian? That kind of...
No, I see it as totally pragmatic.
So you don't
I'm a
think that
materialist. I really believe that you pragmatically work with a society in order to improve the shelter that society needs.
So you see utopianism as an abstraction?
In the way in which it's used, I think it's it's a word as meaningless as ideal, as meaningless as conceptual, as meaningless until it's attached to a particular example, a particular program, a particular notion of form, a particular notion of social and political egalitarianism or what have you. Yeah. In other words, I don't think in the abstract you can talk about utopia.
Is it
I can talk about the literary genre as a literary text. I can talk about the original invented text as something which was deeply involved in the legal and social critique of Henry VII and Henry VIII's England, especially in its critique of the land movement, which was the enclosure movement, which destroyed tiny farms, which deracinated all the peasant workers, which sent them into the cities, which the whole economic movement of landowners beginning to develop large-scale farms for unit for large-scale profit, right? That I think that was a perfectly reasonable tract, just as if you read carefully the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels had a very, very interesting proposition about the cities and the countryside, and bringing the cities and the countryside together in spatial relationships led to all kinds of experiments, like the linear city, like the various kinds of plans that were developed in Russia just after the revolution. But I don't think that's utopian. I think that's a program that could be developed and tested as a planning device. But again, its success or failure is marked by the way in which society evolves within that form of shelter that's given to it, right? Or whether the society participates in the construction of that.
Would you not say that in that pursuit there is inherently a projected ideal of what they're tending towards? Like they have to act towards something.
Yes.
Pragmatically
yes,
speaking.
I think so. I think I would say that. But I think the ideal is less architectural than it is social, which to me is also political.
So it seems like you're advocating maybe for a change of end goal that isn't this kind of idealized utopic. If we think about the city as kind of human dwelling par excellence, we need to direct our energy away from this kind of idealistic vision.
I think, and you asked me about now, right? And the paradigms under which we work. I think that we've been working under a very, 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 since the 70s, under the paradigm of ecological change and potential ecological breakdown, right? Disaster, right? Which has then become phased into a fairly recent interest, which has emerged in anthropology and geology and the other sciences in the Anthropocene, right? It seems to me that while we should be conscious of the end game, which is basically catastrophe, right? And we should also be understanding of the processes that led from the emergence of the Anthropocene to the potential end of the Anthropocene. That what we're missing in that big picture is the moment of temporary relief, is a scalar moment where, yes, actually, if we build that structure, 100 people will have a better life, right? For the moment, right? In their lifetime, right? So I think what's happened is that architectural theory, quote unquote, in its concentration on the virtual networks of theory, which I think is absolutely essential and important, in its concentration on taking from the world of digitalization all the terms that then motivate a kind of interest in swarming and all the kinds of things that social networking can develop and so on. You lose the specificity of a shelter that can help a life. And I think that one of the things that I got yesterday from listening to Bow Wow is the way in which they patiently work with a small group in order to build a small structure and then go on and do another one. But in the end, the accretion of those small structures produces actually a kind of network of places, not no places, real places, that are built out of recycled materials, that are built out of renewable materials, that are conscious of energy, all the things they have to be conscious of, but at the same time, because they've worked so closely with the partners to architecture, which are the inhabitants to the architecture, they transform a little bit the program of social activity in a good way, in an interesting way, which actually I think was the aim of someone like Diderot in the 18th century encyclopedia, when he went into all the factories, all the manufacturers, understood all the tools, understood meticulously the processes of manufacture in order to bring some kind of rationality to the process in order to improve the process, right? Which then, of course, becomes industrial management, which then takes off into something completely other than simply making the technique of fabricating wooden clogs a little bit better, right? So I just think I'm into small scale at this point. I'm into making a difference. I'm into talking to people. I'm into another form of imaginary, if you like. In other words, in talking to people, they are led to imagine what might be better, right? And then you are working towards some form of collective space making. Right? And you can even experiment with the space making.
Would you say that, so then in that situation, architecture's role is the practical or pragmatic actualization of that more utopian social ideal?
Well, I don't think it's a utopian. For me, a utopian social idea is something that is has become coded as universal, and I don't believe in universals, except that I believe in bodies. I believe in, I believe in humanoids as opposed to robots, and I think that's where we should be thinking. In terms of, it sounds very, very banal, but I at the same time, I think that what sounds banal when an imaginary architect, and an architect with an imagination like the Bow Wow Group gets hold of it, is anything but banal. In fact, has a resonance and a presence and a sense of. I remember I read a little piece in my talk yesterday from Alvarez's scientific autobiography, where he is looking at a picture of Berlin after the bombing, and he sees the Brandenburg Gate and a field of ruins, and he sees all the great avant-garde utopias of the 20s brought down, right? And then he says, I'm not any more interested in trying to pick up the remains of those ideals. I'm now looking at the ruins with the eyes of an archaeologist and a surgeon. So in other words, what it is you can actually achieve with ruins as a ground. Right? And I think this is what catastrophe, post-catastrophe efforts continuously and more and more and more will have to do, because that's not going to go away. And they're increasing in violence, they're increasing in natural catastrophes and man-made catastrophes. We still are not that far from nuclear annihilation. All the fabric of treaties which held nuclear expansion, at least in abeyance, and even reduced the possibilities of nuclear war, have been thrown to the winds because of economic and nationalistic hubris. And I think we're not in a good shape, right? But I think at the same time, I have undergraduates at Cooper who are absolutely, frozen by the prospect of where we are, right? And at the same time, there's always time to build a hut. There's always time to think about how that hut might be built and who it's for and what it's made of, where it's placed, how it's lit. That's a good idea, because somebody might need it.
But you're talking about the banal and the idea of building a hut. Simply building a hut makes me think of Ernst Bloch's Concrete Utopia.
Yes.
And that sounds similar to what you're describing as maybe.
Yes. I would say if you're going to use the word utopia at all, then what I'm saying is utopia.
Fantastic. And you did mention how kind of our digital world, our reliance on social media, has really changed interconnectivity, and I'm wondering if maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
Well, it's interesting. After Fukushima, you have that sense that that connectivity of the people who are survived was actually affected by the fact that they could connect with each other. That small businesses and farmers could find where there was a warehouse with still goods stored in it. Or how people could begin, well, over here and over here and over here. That becomes absolutely remarkable and essential and never happened before, so to speak. It certainly didn't happen after Hiroshima. But so there is an incredible positivity to social media, but also we know that all technology has its incredibly dark side, and that we have to combat the other forms of social media, which are to do with the disruption of all social norms. But no, I think what I was saying more is that while I think it's really interesting to talk about virtual infrastructure as well as infrastructure, there is always a physical ground for the virtual infrastructure. There are either large data farms in the desert, or there's something physical there, no matter what, right? And there's always someone there too. It's not all robotics, right? Once it becomes all robotics, then I think it's going to be a problem. I mean, I think that anyway, I'll hold off on my tirade against self-driving cars. And I guess self-driving cars would work if every car was self-driving, and the network was perfect, and there were no hackers. Right? But I don't understand how this notion of security is so lightly understood in the developments of. I remember when I first went to LA, I was offered and wanted an alarm system on my house. Right? I was offered an alarm system that would enable me, as I left my place of work, switch on the coffee pot in my house, so that the coffee would be steaming hot when I got home. Or I could let in my housekeeper, or I could turn on the sprinklers for the lawn and turn them off. Right? I said I don't want it. I had no sense for an absolute imminent disaster that could arise from such a technology. Given that I always lose my phone anyway, and somebody else would find it. So there's a certain sense where you really got to begin to. Now, I think really my problem is that too much architectural theory, too much urban theory has become obsessed with the virtual, as opposed to coming back to the physical and the practical and the pragmatic. And therefore quality of design, because I think only with the pragmatic and the material and the social can you actually achieve quality in design. And that's what I'm a formalist. I love design. I'm not someone who is sort of acting design out of this future. I want the future to be designed, right? To have a very high quality of design. But I think that the kind of design quality that was developed in Ulm, for example, the design qualities that Braun manufacturing developed in the 60s and 70s, the kinds of work that the Eameses were developing in LA, these are absolutely central to our well-being as survivors on the planet. But I think that you can't do that if you're only thinking at the scale of the Anthropocene.
do you think? So, what do you think is the point of architecture now? Is it to provide the hut, one community at a time?
I think it can do that. It can also provide paradigms for testing out, paradigms for experimenting with. But I don't think those paradigms are necessarily, given the extremely diverse climates that we now have to deal with and the extremely exaggerated versions of climates that we have to deal with, they're necessarily not going to be universal. Right? Nor are they going to be simply blanketed between tropical architecture and non-tropical architecture. The architecture is going to have to be very responsive to extremes. Right? So there, I think, we have to think about climate, but climate in a very local sense. Just as we have to think about societies. I just heard this talk on the treatment of death in Japan. Right? Certain ritual treatments of death, which are now becoming mechanized, so you can now send the ashes of your loved one by Amazon to the last resting place, and so on and so forth. But the mechanisms are still there, and it's still a cultural mechanism which is not gone away even with technology. Right? So to a certain extent, when I would be thinking architecturally in that culture, I'd be thinking about serious questions about that culture. That culture would have to tell me a lot of what it was about in order to design the hut.
Is there
the shrine, or
right.
or the last resting place,
yeah.
right? Or the birthing container, or whatever it would be.
Does that approach an almost utopian movement, because you start
in the way in which you're using utopian, which is just as far as I can see a kind of Greek ideal, sort of a generic term for idealism, or a generic term
right.
for something that might be better than something else. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, I'm not sure that I don't. I just finished this book on Utopia, and it's about all the different varieties of the way in which the word has been used and applied and refabricated since Plato, right? We never used the word, right? It was only used after the 15th century to Plato,
yeah.
to characterize Plato as idealistic, which he wasn't, and so on. So, I don't mind obviously I don't mind the word, but I do think it has to have a certain specificity of the way in which it's brought forward and used. Right? I like to think of Utopia as a genre, as a literary genre, as a textual, critical genre. I would think Ernst Bloch would be one of those. That Principle of Hope is actually a utopian narrative in a philosophical vein, right? Back to the expressionist philosophical vein. So yes, I think that, and Fred Jameson, I think, is absolutely correct in thinking that there are utopian narratives embedded in science fiction, as well as their opposite, dystopian. But to me, that's fine. That's a literary critical genre that allows you to reflect on your present with the potential explanation of what that present might be or might not be and could be, right? And yeah, you could draw architectural diagrams in relationship to what you think are preferred environments, right? But I cannot ever believe that there is one ideal environment, that there is a universal ideal in architecture. Which is why I like it, otherwise it'd be boring. My teacher at Cambridge, Colin Rowe, said, Utopia, utter bore. Right?
Yes.
Because, if you look at Hilbersheimer, if you look at all those things, I mean, you wouldn't want to live in that city.
I have a question from behind the camera. I was wondering if you are able to speak on the idea of a distinction between something considered incremental change but is largely palliative versus something that is is maybe an incremental change that's different from utopian, but still is progressive in a way that adds to an end goal in architecture?
Well, I would distinguish between two forms of change. One is the change that occurs immediately after a major catastrophe, and that would have to be palliative. I mean, it would have to be immediately remedial in terms of providing, as Shigeru Ban does, a whole series of structures for temporary shelters, right? And then the next stage, right? How does that community get put together again? Right? So I don't think there's anything utopian about that, but I certainly do believe there's something. There are progressive ways of dealing with that and retrogressive ways of dealing with that. And that's all ways to do with the notion of where the discipline was, what the discipline used to provide, and how it might be transformed in order to accomplish something new, or in order to deal with a situation that it hasn't dealt with before, or to recognize that the way in which it's dealt with that situation before has not been particularly palliative or progressive.
So in your view, both modes of change are still, again, positive?
Well, I don't think that the models that we have received from the modern movement, or that we have received from postmodernism, for architecture of a social and positive mode are fit for our present situation.
But perhaps your argument is also that there is no model. If you are attentive to each location,
The model
each community.
is a model of procedure. It's the model of process.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I argue about Plato is that his whole concentration, Plato never says anything. He only says what other people say. The other only says what Socrates said. Right? We don't know what Plato means. We have Socrates engaging in argument with a whole range of very different kinds of philosophers. Sometimes he seems to win, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes it might be that we can imagine that Plato is taking the side of one or another of the actors, but it's like saying Shakespeare said, right? Shakespeare there's no way of saying what Shakespeare, as a philosopher, as a thinker, as a politician, meant. You can put Hamlet next to King Lear, next to Henry VIII, next to, Julius Caesar. This does not tell you what Shakespeare said. Just the same, Plato never said anything. He only wrote a series of dramatic discourses where there's a lot of discussion. Right? And in that discussion, sometimes questions of what would be a city which was affording justice to all its citizens might be. Plato, in the way in which he stages his conversations, makes it evident that at least Socrates believes that there is a certain relationship between a just subject and a just city. So, but this, in the late 19th century, people started to translate all the discourses again. They made diagrams of circles and all that kind of stuff, but Plato never made those diagrams. He never planned a city. He described a number of kinds of cities that were all socially described in relationship to their governorship, but he never actually planned a city. The only city, in fact, he described in absolute detail was the city of Athens. Was a diagrammatic presentation of the city of Athens in its most decadent moment, which was when he was living. That's Thomas More's description of England, right? And he called it Atlantis, and sunk it, right? Destroyed it because it was corrupt. So it's very interesting. It's often thought that Atlantis was an ideal city. Nothing of the kind. It was the anti-Athens. It was anti what Athens had become, and therefore to be destroyed.